Hi, this is Jack Vinson, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko. Once again, we are in another episode of the ToC-aissance. We're going to be talking about theory of constraints. And in the next episode, which is the next one in our series, we are greatly honored to have a ToC extraordinaire on the call with us. We have Mr. Jack Vinson. Jack, thank you for joining us.
Welcome. Thank you.
It is our pleasure. The pleasure is ours. And for this episode, we're going to be talking about critical chain project management. Now, hold on. Everybody who's listening is going, wait, you're an Agile show. Why are you talking about critical chain project management? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, being it's a theory of constraints related way of looking at projects. Second reason is I guarantee most of us who call ourselves Agilists still work in companies that have project managers and some concept of the project. And the third thing is, as someone who is a quote unquote reformed project manager, I did not come across any of this at all whatsoever when I was doing my PMBOK classes. And I honestly think this is 10,000 times better than Waterfall. It takes a lot of the things that we seem to hold important in the Agile world into account. So with that, we're going to dive right in. But first, Jack, for our listeners that may not be familiar with you, I sidle up next to you in a bar and I say, hey, who are you and what do you do? Your answer is?
I am a consultant. I work with a lot of companies, and my real focus is on helping companies create flow and primarily around projects. So getting those projects unstuck, figuring out what's causing the project system to get stuck, and really finding ways to unblock that flow and enable flow. I focus on using the theory of constraints concepts in that, but there's a lot of good concepts and a lot of people have had a lot of great things, and I try to employ whatever makes sense or in that context.
Right. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The key is having multiple types of hammers to know which one to use. So how did you get into, Jack, how did you come across critical chain project management?
So I first came across it through some colleagues. I worked at a pharmaceutical company in Chicago called Searle. And a couple of my colleagues were looking at improving how we did projects. This was in the days in pharmaceuticals where the big blockbusters in many companies, it's where Lipitor came out. It's where we were working on Celebrex. It's where Pfizer had Vioxx, like all these big multi-billion-dollar drugs were coming out. And the big push was we need to find ways to get these products from like the first idea to market way faster. It was like, it's a 10-year process. And I think it's still in that ballpark. But one of the things that, so that's a Mongo project. And if you know anything about pharmauticals, they investigate thousands and thousands of compounds, of molecules before they finally get to the one over many years that is the one that they're going to take to market. And many of those don't even make it through the trials that you hear about for clinical trials. But one big piece of that is the projects within that massive project, right? So my background's in engineering, chemical engineering, and we were looking at, well, how do we get through just the engineering phase of this? How do we figure out how to make this stuff more effectively? How do we figure out how to get it from, well, we know how to make it in a couple hundred grams to we can make it in several hundred kilograms, right? So in that context, we were really investigating many, many options of enabling people to work better. Being a kind of a polyglot interest, I was interested in knowledge management, which was really focused on how do people learn things? How do people keep things together? How do they remember what they did last year? All that, it was a lot of fun. But one of the things we were looking at was project management. And I had a colleague who was looking at finite simulation of the pilot plant. Like, how do we super optimize the pilot plant? And of course, a couple of years later, I learned that, wait a minute, the pilot plant should never be optimized. It should never be fully loaded because it's a resource that needs to be available instantaneously. And if it's optimized, it means you're probably not going to be loaded instantaneously. If you think of Little's Law and you've got all this stuff working on it, and well, okay, what if you need an emergency job run through the pilot plant? It needs to have capacity. So that was an interesting discovery. And so my first experience with theory of constraints was in that context, right? Of we're trying all these things. And one of the, actually, so we were looking at finite element scheduling. And then we also looked at, well, what if we just think about the work getting to the pilot plant and through the pilot? What if you think of that as a project and flow the work that way? And we I will say we learned a lot, but we didn't really succeed in using that concept in the context of the pilot plant. And I think later discovering, because of we made some assumptions about the way that the pilot plant should be operating and loaded as to in the context of a project. If you think about the idea of a constraint in theory of constraints, it didn't work out for a number of reasons, but I learned about it. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting concept. And then, of course, a couple of years later, I continued working with that same group of people. And now we had been merged with another company, still in the pharmaceutical industry. And now we had research, we had manufacturing facilities, we were building new facilities, and we needed some mechanism to be able to really understand what was going on in all these projects. And we had learned a little bit more about critical chain, and really like, okay, we're going to use critical chain to manage our research projects, to manage this. There was one particular, a new pilot plant, biological pilot plant, like class 10,000 facility that was being built, that of course was having all the classic problems, right? There was a concrete shortage, there was a labor issue, there, like you name them, they were all happening. And then we were also managing a number of our late stage projects, drug projects with this same concept. And the big challenge for that at that point was, almost every project environment, what's your issue? And then you've got your long list of 100 things, right?
Yep.
And it was every week, here's all this stuff that we got to fix. And once we started implementing critical chain, we started finding, number one, we had a project plan, which we really didn't have before. We had the thing on the back of an envelope or somebody's Excel file that nobody ever looked at again. And then once we started getting into the habit of, well, what's the thing that's blocking this project? We could use the techniques, and we'll talk about these, I think, in this conversation about what are some of these techniques, but we could use the techniques as, what is the one thing that's blocking this project right now? And they shifted, the leadership team shifted from a weekly, half day long slog fest of all the issues to bi-weekly. And here's the project. Here's the one thing that is the issue for the project today. And, maybe there's a couple things coming, but here's the one thing that we need to worry about. The leadership could, if they could do something about it, had a very simple way to mechanism to resolve those and lead those forward. And I just fell in love with the concepts. I was involved pretty heavily on the implementation side. I worked with the project managers. I worked with the software. I was kind of more of a gearhead than I am now in that regard. And we really made that sing and learned a lot about how to think about projects, how to think about how people work together, because it's easy to think about projects as this thing over here.
Right. As an abstract until
exactly.
You have to apply
it's people.
it to people.
I love that there's the other podcast that does people and projects, and there's that Agile principle that it's the people that do the work. It's not all the processes. So that was a really important beginning of a discovery. And then from there, I left that particular company and continued on my own. And I've worked with many, many types of companies in that arena. I've also done other theory of constraints related things, but my first love has always been the critical chain project management side of things.
That's awesome. And for me, so again, I had no idea what this was until, truthfully, I picked up the book Hanging Fire, which is Jeff Cox, one of the co-authors of The Goal. The running joke is every ToC book is all a narrative story, which makes them easy to get through, right?
Many of them are.
Clark's is Agile and ToC, and then there's Epiphanize, which I have over here, which is ToC Six Sigma and what is it? And Lean. And I had never heard of this before, whatever. And I have taken my PMP courses. I've done, I got my master's in applied project management. And I was kind of like, well, how have I never heard of this before? And then I started digging in. And that's when I reached out to Johanna Rothman, shout out to Johanna. And I said, Johanna, who do you know that does CCPM? And you were the first person she sent me. So the first thing I want to talk about, Jack, is the critical difference in nomenclature, where in the waterfall world, we have the critical path.
Right.
But CCPM is critical chain.
Right.
And can you, and this was the first question that somebody ever asked me, and I kind of want you to answer it so I can know if my answer was spot on or not. But this, I think, kind of not only sets the table, but it opens up the dialogue in the mind that there's a different way of doing things. Can you expand a bit about how, there is, what the difference is between a critical chain versus a critical path?
Wow. So, I'm just thinking there's many ways to think about that, even that question. The simplest is that critical chain tries to account for resource availability in thinking about how long is the project. So if you only have one person on the team that knows, I don't know, pick your, let's closure, right?
Java. Right. Yeah, closure. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to be modern. Right. If there's really only one person on the team that knows that, maybe there's a different problem. And you need to do there's two sequences of work that need a closure expert. Don't plan those things to be done at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the simplest version of what critical chain is. There's a whole lot underneath that we I think we need to talk about of what's really the difference between critical chain and critical path. There's a huge mindset difference between critical chain and critical path. And I think the reason that people kind of have a visceral negative reaction in the Agile community about Waterfall is that there's this belief, I think I've heard the phrase big design up front, right? Mm-hmm. That we plan everything and everything will follow that plan regardless. And in critical chain, we're like, no, there's variability in the world. We know
mm-hmm.
there's variability in the world. We can't predict when there's going to be variability in the world. We need to find, I think the other big change, hopefully I'm not getting too excited, the other big difference between the traditional waterfall critical path way of thinking and the critical chain way of thinking is that let's acknowledge that there's variability. Let's not believe that we can drive all variability out and get perfect estimates of everything. And I know that's a big topic in the Agile community as well, the idea of estimating mm-hmm. durations or times or whatever's. But let's acknowledge that there is variability and find an appropriate way to manage that variability. And in this context of a project, which is more a sequence of work, I must do A before I can start B, before I can start C, right? And of course, there's many paths that feed together, but the whole thing comes down to a successful delivery of the value of the project, whether that's a new physical object, a new drug that I can send to the market, a new software delivery, the whole package, whatever mm-hmm. it is. All that has to sequence together and synchronize. And the idea of managing the variability ends up in this idea of a buffer, which I think is something that we'll talk about. The critical chain plan, in some senses, looks a bit different than a critical path plan, but otherwise, there's still,
there's a lot of
and you need
to
understand
overlap there.
Yeah, you still need to understand what comes before what to be able to build those plans. You can't just throw a list of tasks out on a wall and expect it to get done without understanding the sequence and the logic.
You just talked about buffers, so I do want to go into that next, but I will use my example. My explanation was when someone asked me, what's the difference between like waterfall and this and critical, why do you say critical chain versus critical path? My explanation was when you think of waterfall and critical path, there's only one true acceptable way through the forest, right?
Right.
You can go off into the woods and it can get dicey. And that's not to say that you won't find your way out of the forest, but that's the waterfall way of looking at it, where there's a critical path. Whereas the critical chain, to me, it was, there is one critical piece, which is your constraint, which we'll talk mm-hmm. about shortly, that is literally pulling the work through the system at the right pace.
Yes.
And the idea is of a chain is with a chain, there's actually, it's not always stretch taut. And we're going to talk about the buffers that there's the ability to, and you know, in the Agile community, we talk a lot about leading indicators. That's one of the things that my spider sense ticked off when I read about this is, you know, we harp about leading versus lagging indicators. And we're going to go, let's get into this now. With Waterfall, almost everything is a lagging indicator. Well,
yes,
Jack, I had to hand this work off to you and I'm 5 days behind. So now my project is officially red, right? Whereas when you have a true buffer, you will know by the buffer burn rate, the buffer utilization rate, hey, things are kind of going sideways. So let's talk about the idea of buffers, Jack.
Sure.
They're all over the place, but in its simplest form, it is what?
Yeah. So in critical chain, it's the buffer is a time buffer, and this is usually typically the project buffer. There's a couple other buffers as well if you read the literature, but there's a time buffer at the end of the project. And in sort of the vanilla version of critical chain, the buffer is about a third of the duration of the time you allot to the project. So if you have allotted 120 days, 40 days of that is buffer and 80 days of that is project tasks. And the assumption is that I've allotted 120 days to the project, not 80. I've allotted that entire project time. And what I'll do, exactly as you said, as I continue progressing through the project, as I get information, as things happen in the project, as we learn new things as we go, which we always do. And I think that's another big assumption. I think it's an issue. One of the issues I have with people who say all project management is bad is that there's the way it's written or the way it's understood is that it's fixed. And that causes a lot of angst for people. And, you know, every task has its own date. And if I miss that date, I get hammered. So I think in real project, in good, it's sort of good,
it's good project management.
Good project management. People deal with this kind of stuff as well, but I think it's not as visible or obvious. It's all done by I think what often happens is it's all done by the project manager. And they like it's their project, and everybody else just does the work for them. Whereas I think in critical chain and actually any good project management and Agile, we're all working together for the same goal.
Very much. It's very much egalitarian in its outlook. Yes.
Yeah. So the question back about the buffer, the idea of the buffer is it's showing me how am I making progress on the work, and how am I consuming that buffer at the end. So generally what we say is we fully expect to consume the full buffer. So again, I just used 120 days because that's nicely divides into 1/3 and 2/3. But if I've completed 20% of the longest chain, sorry, the critical chain, there goes my clock. If I've completed 20% of the longest chain, but I've consumed 40% of the buffer already, that's already a wonderful indicator for me that, hey, I'm consuming that buffer much faster than I'm getting work done. Awesome. That's great to know. It doesn't tell me I'm going to be late. It just tells me that I've consumed that buffer more than I would expect to on an average flow. Now, but I can do wonderful things. I can look at, okay, well, what's remaining? Do I expect the same amount of variability in what's remaining? Now that we've gotten into the project, given what's remaining, can we rethink it? Can we rethink about how it sequences? How much time do we really think we're going to need? All these great questions that we should fully expect to ask. And I love this topic, as you can tell. I think one of the things that makes the shift from critical chain or from waterfall sort of traditional project management, if there is such a thing, to the critical chain mindset is that when we start the work, we strive to finish it as quickly as possible. Right. So whether it's the project itself, or it's a phase of the project, or it's a task on the project, we strive to finish it as quickly as possible. And often, if you read the critical chain literature, people really love the idea of the relay race analogy. But I pick up the baton. I've got my team, I've got the people that do the work, I've got all the supporting resources, and we move as quickly as possible. And again, I sometimes get a little worried about using the term resources because people get hung up on treating people as resources.
But I mean,
yeah, but I've got the skills and the capabilities and the everything lined up so that I can get the work done. And and I think this is a key aspect in Agile too. With Agile, we we bring everybody together and get the work done.
Right,
With critical chain, I think there's one of the things I think that bug me a little bit sometimes in critical chain is that each task still has an owner and it's theirs, right?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
But really it's our work. And yes, okay, yeah, you've got that. You're the person with the current top skill that is needed on that activity, but I need all the inputs that everybody else provides. There's going to be help that I'm going to need that I can't get it all, in any modern project, we can't do it by ourselves. I think there's still a little bit of that nature of, my work is mine and I need to protect it, which is, by the way, which is where we get the buffer from. So I already talked about making sure that we can complete the activity when we get it. So this is the idea of if you, again, the relay racer, once they get the baton, there is nothing in their way until they hand it off to the next person.
Right.
But now we have fun conversations about what does done look like, and
right.
Which I know is a fun concept in the Agile
world. Yeah, we're still arguing about that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
When I first came across the buffer concept, I was kind of rolling it around in my head, and I thought about it. If you and this is also my difference between traditional waterfall versus critical chain. In traditional waterfall, you have a buffer; it's implicit, and the reason it comes about is, Jack, you're the head of this team. How long is this going to take to build? And it's going to take 8 days. So you tell me 15, and then you tell me 15, and I add another week onto that, and I combine. So at the end of the day, to use your example, everybody on the project thinks we have 120 days, whereas my joke about critical chain, I said, is it's at war with Parkinson's law. You're trying to prevent the work to fill the available space. So with a critical chain plan versus a traditional waterfall plan, instead of saying everybody knowing we have 120 days, everybody knows that, okay, we have 80 days and we have 40 days of buffer in the event that something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And even just that tiny, it's almost a silly semantic argument, makes a huge difference in perception. And I mean, you talked about estimates, right? That was the other thing that jumped out at me. There's all these, every Agile nerd and their mother wants to argue about estimates, no estimates, some estimates, predictions, whatever.
Yes.
With critical chain, I love the concept of, you go to the team that owns it, right? Or the person, we talked about that. And you say, well, how long is this going to take? And they don't give you one estimate, they give you two. They give you okay, if the stars align and my wife doesn't yell and I just happen to have everything ironed and ready, it'll take 10 days. Realistically, odds are it's going to take 15. So that's where you're starting to build your buffers out of, because someone is giving you I think it's the aggressive but probable versus the, based upon a histogram, I can tell you that 95% of the time we deliver this in this way.
So this is another, so that topic is one of those fun ones in the critical chain community as well. How do you get your estimates? What kinds of estimates do you use? 2-point estimates? There's one group that was doing 3-point estimates. I prefer just, let's just use the estimates as the way we've guesstimated, because it's guesses, right? Let's just guesstimate the way we now, and just assume that for any task of a decent duration, 5-10 days, there's so much time in there of, I'm waiting for stuff, I'm multitasking, I don't have everything I need, my car broke down, right? There's all of these things that cause if you look at we love this, we love our analogies, but if you look at the real touch time to get the work done, it's a very small fraction of the 10 days or the 15 days or whatever it was that was my estimate. So what we suggested, I'm just starting to use slightly different language here, is instead of talking about, well, you've got buffer in the task and we're going to take some of that and give it to the project, we're saying, look, we want to have a estimate at the time of doing the work that is reasonably conceivable that I could get it done in that time, but allow for the fact that, something might happen. That's what the buffer is for. Something might happen. And you said perfectly, right? We're trying to reduce the likelihood of Parkinson's law striking, which is the work expands to fill the time. And we're trying to reduce the other one, which is student syndrome. Do you know this one, which is, I wait to the last possible minute to start?
Oh yeah, that's welcome to my life. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're very similar, right? I
Mhm.
believe I have 15 days. In my head, I know, well, I've got all this other stuff that I've got to go on. I don't really know that that's only going to take me 3 days. So I'm going to start about 5 days before it's due. And if I get it done on time, then all is golden. And I get a pat on the back because you got it done on the right date. But in the critical chain world, that doesn't fly anymore.
Right.
Get it done as fast as soon as you are available to do the work, and you have everything you need to successfully complete it, get it done.
Yep.
So if you have to wait for a few days because you're missing some piece of the kit to do the work, let people know. Hey, I'm not able to start this because I'm missing a document, or I'm missing an approval, or my team member who's key to doing this work is actually working on a more important project right now.
Which
I'm going to wait.
You bring up the perfect point of this is where critical chain is truly a kissing cousin to some of the stuff we preach in the Agile world. It's the idea of multitasking, right? The idea of Team Jack is on the critical path. They're on the critical chain for this piece. They can't be messing around with 6 or 7 things because, and it's, again, we talk about the concept of being comfortable with having people be idle, be ready for the work to come in, because that will lead to a smoother transition. And that was another thing where I was like, well, I thought about my old days as a PM where January 2nd hits and everybody's got funding. So we start every project at once.
Yes.
And here now we're talking about ToC, right? Theory of constraints comes in because I know that the biggest constraint is our automated pre-production testing. And all these projects are hammering these poor 5 guys all at once because we spun up everything at once. We had no concept of what the constraint was. And now everything is delayed. And now everybody has to go to that come to Jesus meeting at 9:00 on Monday morning and explain to the executive vice president of solutions delivery, why is everything delayed? And it's not a good look.
That's a beautiful example. And that almost every project looks like design, build, test, launch, or release, or send it to the store or whatever, right? And when we do that, and many companies are in that mode of operation of, we release all the projects when we get funding, and all the projects magically take a funding period to finish.
Exactly, right?
Whether it's a year or 6 months or whatever it is.
That's the whole monster of, I got this much budget, I have to use it. I committed to this project in January, I have to deliver it, even though COVID-19 happened and I kind of don't need it because my entire world has changed, but I committed to this, and here's where it gets ugly. My incentive is based upon me delivering that. So we just do it anyway.
Yep. So we've introduced about a zillion variants on the critical chain topic. We could talk about multi-projects. We could talk more about, I think we've probably hammered the buffer pretty well. There's more, of course, with that topic.
Let's talk about multi projects. Jack, because I mean, let's call a spade a spade, right? So first of all, there's a lot of Agile practitioners who want to throw out everything project manager related. Right. You're painting with a broad brush, right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The best example I can give to every Agilist I know is, I used to work at a company that did branded credit cards, right? So you came to us and we did like the Jack Vinson Inc. MasterCard. While the software delivery was done in an iterative fashion, we were chunking out the work and banging through that as fast as possible. There was still a concept of creatives need to be done. The marketing needs to be created. The ads have to go out. So there is some concept of a chain of work, a path of work. And to say that, we're in the post-project world and everything's going to be Agile is kind of naive and ignorant, I think, and a little bit delusional. So a lot of companies still have, I mean, again, if you still fund projects, you still have project managers, you're not going to get away from it. So let's talk about how to do this, how to apply this critical chain thinking. And I know this is where the constraint comes into play because I've read the book, in multi-project environments.
Right. So in a project, the constraint is however long it takes you to get the project done. And for critical chain, that is the longest sequence of work, including resource contention plus the buffer. So that's the constraint of any one project. But now if you start thinking, okay, I'm going to be running multiple projects through the same set of people, right? The same teams, and by the way, inside the company, contractors, vendors, right? All of this are the pool of skills and people and technology and equipment that I need to run these projects through. Now, if you think that they're all doing some version of design, build, test, launch, right? I need to design my creative, I need to test it with consumers and then launch it, or integrate it with the software, or all these things have to integrate. Now you can start looking across all these projects, assuming you have a project plan that describes what skills and resources you need, and say, well, okay, if I have 10 of these projects running at the same time, which types of resource, and again, I'm using resource more broadly, not only skills, but it could be which types of vendor, which types of equipment, which types of servers do I see where I need, if I run them all exactly at the same time and they're all the same duration, which, by the way, no projects are all really the same duration. We make them that way, as we were just describing. Where do the highest peaks come on those key resources? And typically in the classical theory of constraints world, with like a manufacturing operation, we typically say there is pretty much going to be one constraint in the flow of a manufacturing facility. In projects, we find that it's at least one. Sometimes there's one at the early phases of the project, like the designer or the architect, because they're needed across all these projects to really understand how are these going to synchronize together. And there may even be integration points even across projects, but I should probably stop with that one. And then you might have something at the end, like you said, like a release engineer or other activity that's a key role that is going to be heavily loaded if we stack all these projects on top of each other. So the key idea with a constraint is, well, number one, we find out where it is. And I think I'm thinking of like the Phoenix project, which was the one architect was the constraint for the entire system. And we do two things, and I think the Phoenix project does a nice job of describing this. One is we make sure that we don't release work to those constraint areas. We want to make sure that they're not multitasking. So maybe up front it's an architect, and the back end, maybe the back end is a vendor service that I bought, but I've only bought so much of it. And now I don't want to overload them, because then everything takes longer to understand what multitasking means. So now I want to stagger the release of the work so that all of those projects get done in the timing that I need them and deliver the value accordingly, right? So now I'm going to stagger the first one, the highest value project, then the next value project. And maybe that even means I'm going to pull in a project a little bit earlier to maybe take advantage of a low period or something like that. So now I can start really thinking about, how do I want to manage my portfolio of work? The other thing that I wanted to highlight is, if we know where our constraint is, like it's a very small group, or it's a key skill that is really hard, maybe it's somebody that's trained in the industry forever. I don't know. We're still all doing COBOL for some reason.
Yeah, it's never going to go away. It's never going to go away.
Right. Or, my dad just passed away last year, but he was still doing Fortran programming because he loved it. And I'd occasionally come over, and his fingers were getting sloppy and he was making typos, but I was able to help him have some fun. Anyway, sorry, sidetrack. The other thing we want to make sure is that when that constraint is active, again, typically people in the context of projects, if they're the constraint, we're giving them gold. And we're giving them only things that they can do. All the other stuff, if it's stuff that maybe a junior team can work on, or a junior person with that skill, maybe it's an easier assignment. Let's not make sure that they're not working on the easy stuff. Let's make sure that they're working on the stuff that's really hard, that nobody else can figure out. And I think that in the Phoenix project, that what they described was, and there's always somebody watching over their shoulder so that they can learn the hard stuff too. Yeah. So that we're not, particularly if it's a constraint of one, but even if it's like a vendor that we've got outsourced capability to, we give the vendor what they need. We ask the vendor, hey, what is it that you need so that you can be successful in completing this for us? Because, by the way, the more you're successful in completing it for us, the more likely it is that we're going to bring you more work. So it's good
the
for
work
them.
doesn't stop. It's how we sequence
the work isn't going to stop. Right. Are we giving them the right stuff? If they have a question, do we get back to them right away, or do we get back to them next week?
Yeah.
Right.
This is where the Agile monster comes into play. Yep.
And we delay a response, we've just lost all sorts of time for it, all just waiting time that we've just lost. And the other one is some version of clear scope, right? So if we're working with, particularly with vendors, that, here's really what we want you to do. This is what we want you to do. Nothing more, nothing less. And don't keep changing it on them, right? How many times do we do that to our vendors, or even to our colleagues?
Yeah, it is it's kind of sad and kind of amusing. I've always said that you do this IT shit long enough. There's a sitcom. There's a 10-season sitcom in there. If anybody would just slow down to read the book about how to write a script. But you talk about the constraint, right? It's typically either one person or it's a team. And the thing that it keeps coming up in every single one of these episodes we've done in the series is time lost on the constraint is revenue lost you're not going to get back. So you need to keep them busy at a measurable pace. And the other side of that is, I came across a statement where is when you increase your throughput, you're making time. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And then when I dove into it, it's, like back to our example. If I say if we think it's going to take 80 days with a 40-day buffer, so 120 days total, we tell the customer it takes 120 days, it takes 96. Well, what does that give us? Well, that gives us 24 days back. Now the customer's happy. We can then fill that 24 days and here's where the Agile comes in, shifting the next program left.
Yes.
So we've actually, we've created higher throughput with no change to our current operating model expense. We didn't ramp up a whole bunch of people and drive Fred Brooks nuts, right? Trying to throw people at a project. We've shifted left. We've started new things earlier. And we're filling that free time with an initiative that might not have gotten done. Again, we're making time, we're making more money. And when I tried to pitch this back to somebody else, I said, think about it. We're not spinning up new teams. This is people that we currently have, that the cost that we're expecting, but now we're getting more work out of them. And it was kind of like all these fireworks started going off. It's like, because everybody does the whole OpEx dance. Oh, we need you to increase your throughput and minimize your operating expense. Let's cut off some contractors. And it's like, wow, what are we talking about?
Well, you hit on it perfectly, right? So if I'm able to see that, hey, this particular project looks like it's moving much faster. It's completed 50% of the work on the longest chain, but it's only consumed, 25% of the buffer. Now it's going to, hey, it looks like this one's going to potentially finish early. How can we take advantage of that? Can we now start, again, with a judicious look at the remaining work? Can we promise that this one's going to be delivered early and start thinking about what's the next one that's going to maybe pull in a little bit earlier? How do we take advantage of this? And even in planning, we can start thinking about, hey, you know what? I love the claim that nobody's going to pay for it earlier if we get it done early, which I'm like, well, why are we doing any? That's another fun guy. But even if it's really true that nobody's going to pay for it before July 1st because it's a financial year turnover thing, maybe we can start it a month later and do something else, right? So that 24 days you just described, we can use it in either place. If we start seeing this repeatability and this behavior in our overall flows, maybe we have some opportunities to take advantage at the front end and not get so worried about cost of delay at the back end. And of course, the other fun thing is understanding what the project is. I think most of the critical chain literature doesn't make it, or makes an assumption that it's obvious why the project is what it is. It makes an assumption that everybody knows what the goal is. Everybody knows the value. And I've been finding in some circumstances that even having the conversation about, is it clear what the goal is? What are we really delivering? What is the customer, and not only the requester, but the customer, the person that's going to buy the end result of this? What do they really want? And what are they getting out of this project? And of course, from a financial terms, what's the value of it? Value per day. What's the cost of delay potentially? What's the value of bringing it in early? Why is that date so interesting to you? You've told me you want it to be done on I don't know, July 15th. What's interesting about that date? Oh, it's because there's a regulation coming in and we need. Oh, great. That's great to know. Now, if we miss that date, it's a huge penalty. And if we're early, it's gonna give us some buffer. So that's good to know, right? So we need to know these kinds of things. Or, it's I'm selling this to a retailer, and the retailer wants to get it on their shelves before high season, whatever the before school high season, or the Christmas high season, or it's candy and it's the Easter high season, or whatever it might be.
Right. And I just had this conversation with Graham Scott, where we were talking about the idea of throughput accounting,
Yes.
and using that whole concept of decision making based upon, okay, well, what's going to be the most judicious for me? And your statement of, well, maybe I can start this project later and fill that buffer with other stuff. That was the first time I'd ever heard somebody say, well, we could start things later. It's like the first time you ever hear. I just said it to Graham. Steve Tendon had a great quote. We were talking about his tame flow Kanban and utilization and all that. And Steve made a remark where he goes, I'm putting this on a poster. He goes, because we were talking about the whole idea of, I'm paying for people and people need to be busy, but you're going to pay for them regardless if they're busy or not. And
Yes.
if it's for the benefit of this process, it makes sense to have them do nothing. And Steve said, well, if you have nothing to do, just go fishing. And I'm putting that on a poster because he's right. I mean, it's you do more harm than good just picking up something and pushing it into the process because I've got idle hands. Yeah. Whereas measuring what's at the constraint and getting the flow through the system is way more important.
It another fun conversation in the theory of constraints community around that. If I really have nothing to do and I'm really like in that flow mindset of, when it comes to me, I'm going to pick it up and move it as quickly as I can to done, to really done, and hand it off. Right. If I really have nothing to do, I don't have any shadowing to do. I don't have any education I need to do. Is it okay to sit up with my feet on the table and my head, just thinking in the clouds? And you know what? Yes, it has to be okay. We get so wrapped up in, you're right, the idle resource is a waste picture. And that mindset, if that's deeply embedded in me or in my company, that mindset drives us to start more and more and more, which drives us to multitask, which almost inevitably drives us to the way of operation that we're trying to, I'm going to say, fight against, which is every task has a due date. And if you miss the due date, the task is red. Like, I don't care if the task missed a date. Is it going to affect the flow of the project?
Yes.
And
is it going to affect
that's
the value
the one that
end?
I'm more interested in. That's the topic that I'm interested in. How is this going to affect the flow? Anything we can do to improve the flow of the project and of the work in general is going to help us, right? And now we think, okay, what's going to improve the flow of the project? It's on the critical chain. And even if the critical chain changes halfway through the project, there's still the critical chain. It may be a different one than what we started with, but it's still, here's the place that I need to focus. It's this task followed by all of its successors. That's what's driving the critical chain. That's what's driving the buffer status. And now I have something to work against.
And that's a great segue into, so why my spider sense perked up when I was reading this, especially coming from the Agile world, is there is a lot of applicability in the sense of, the Agile dogmatists will preach from the mountains about you have cross-functional co-located teams.
Yes. Maybe
in startups that happens. Maybe in small companies that happens. Maybe in a company where you have a very hard-headed CIO that will beat people with reeds if they don't have a cross-functional team, it happens. In real life, totally cross-functional teams really doesn't happen. There's always a dependency somewhere, right? So if there's always going to be a dependency somewhere, this is where my Agile nerd went up, right? I say, got your Irish up, I got my Agile nerd up. Because there's always a constraint somewhere. I'm always going to have a dependency with somebody, and typically multiple Agile teams, trains, they always end up at the same bottleneck trying to get work through, right? Is it performance engineering? Is it InfoSec? Is it somebody, right? But that concept still applies. So if I build my chain to understand what's on the critical chain, right? And I'm still doing iterative development, I'm still doing Agile in all my little pieces, right? But I'm explicitly acknowledging the fact that there is a buffer, there is a constraint somewhere, when we need to actively manage that constraint. Because what's the saying? If you're not aware of your constraint is managed. You do have a constraint, and it's managing you.
You don't manage your constraint; it's managing you. Yeah.
That, I think, is highly relevant to any of us that's in an Agile world. You're doing safe, you're doing less, whatever. There is still going to be a constraint somewhere, and you need to be aware of it. And that the utilization of that constraint, that team, that even that train, should drive how you plan everything else. And there does need to be some semblance of plan. And that's where I was like, wow, this is applicable with what I do.
Well, and I think the other thing that sometimes is hard for people to grasp is that the constraint, whether it's one constraint or it's a couple of areas, right? Those are precious resources to the value that the company is delivering. So we need to treat them as such. And this is where, because then of course everybody else will say, well, what about me? What about me? What about us? Like, yeah, everybody's got to dance together to get the project done. But if the release engineers, if we treat them poorly, and again, not necessarily human poorly, but if we don't give them what they need, if we're asking them to do 20 things when they can only possibly do 5, right? All that poorly, then the whole system suffers, including the people who aren't the constraints, because now they're feeling like they're pressured to get into their queue. So now they're going and harassing them and draining even more of their time. So we really need to think about when we know what our constraint is, and again, we manage our constraints well, that we really treat them like gold, right? So we don't give them poor requirements. We don't give them poor specifications, or maybe the reverse, I should say. What do we do? When we give them something, it's everything that we know that they need, and we've talked to them about what we know that they need. This is a great example, even if our constraint isn't maybe the technical people, but in some of the critical chain and theory of constraints literature, sometimes you'll see management as the ultimate constraint, and which is an interesting concept in itself. But if I believe that I need to go to a manager to get some approval or some decision made, what do I bring to them? Do I just say, here, I'm going to just do the data dump onto the manager and please make a decision for me now? They're going to look at me like, wait a minute, you guys on the team know you generated all this data. You know more about this project than I could ever really possibly know. Please bring to me a recommendation, some guidance, give me some options, give me not just the one number, but the variation on that number, whatever. Give me something that I can really use to help guide you, the team, on what is reasonable to do. And now the other one, of course, is maybe we shouldn't be going to management as much as we think we should, but that's another.
Yeah, it's a whole different other monster.
Because of course, going to management, what does that do? It creates another queue of wait time in the project. Yes. Again, because if I believe I need to have that meeting, then I need to schedule it 3 weeks in advance, because they never have time on their calendar. And of course, I'm believing that I'm subordinating myself to my manager's job or the director's time. And really in a well-run, I believe this happens in Agile communities and in companies, in a well-run theory of constraints company, the managers are subordinating to the flow of value.
Yeah.
So if you have a decision to make, I'm ready for you. You bring me what I need so I can make a reasonable decision, but don't wait for me.
Right.
Make the decision and tell me about it. And if it was wrong, I got your back.
It's the whole inverted, leadership pyramid where it's not a pyramid of hierarchy, but it's a support structure. Like think about like a net under a net under a net. The other thing, and I think we'll probably close up with this. The other thing about theory of constraints that I found so fascinating is being aware of this conceptually leads to a more humane way of working. We talk a lot about mental models and theory X and theory Y people. If I know that my team is the constraint, right? We are the ones who everyone is leaning on, right? Everyone else knows that, we interact with each other in a more humane way, because everybody knows that I know that I am, for lack of a better term, the weak link in the chain. I'm the one where all the stressor is put on. Yeah. So, okay, well, we're not going to start 8,000 things and come to Jay like you said, every 10 minutes, ask questions, because Jay's team is that busy. There's almost a tacit acknowledgement of we're creating flow without using the F word, because we're just humanely treating people the way I would want to be if I was in that seat.
Yes.
And it's a totally different. I hope the theory of constraint stuff makes a resurgence. I did have this, I was talking to Clark Ching and we were talking about this as without Ellie being around, that's a big drain, right? Because he was a ginormous personality. And now I'm kind of hoping it doesn't get lost by the wayside. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the series, is we want to elevate some people's knowledge and familiarity with it, because hopefully somebody who hasn't seen it before gets something out of it. So, Jack, we're quickly approaching time. It's getting late here on the East Coast. If our listeners want to find you, if they have questions, if they want to follow your work, if they want to reach out and get in touch, what's the best way to locate you?
I am Jack Vinson just about everywhere. JackVinson. That's my blog, which I've kind of let go fallow, but it's still there. It's my Twitter handle. It's my Facebook handle. I don't like hanging out there as much as I hang out there. That's what I am on LinkedIn. But if jackvinson.com, that'll find me.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Jack, on behalf of all of our listeners, I want to thank you for taking your time. I also want to give a shout out to Johanna Rothman for connecting us. She really is, she's like my Rolodex without being my Rolodex. So thank you to Johanna. Thank you again to Jack for taking your time. On behalf of myself and Jack, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in. We talk project management on the Agile podcast, which is kind of weird, but I think if you're all thinking the way I'm thinking, you can see where this fits. And to that point, I want to remind everyone we have a very, very vibrant Discord server where we are talking about this sort of stuff actively. So if you came across something that you agree with, you disagree with, you vehemently deny, you want to talk about it, come on to the server and let's chat about it. Just remind everyone, if you like what you heard, please give us a review, a rating on iTunes, Stitcher, Audible, your podcasting platform of choice. It does help others find us. I want to give a shout out to Machine Man Records and their artist Krebs, who provided our outro music free of charge, helping us circumvent our YouTube copyright notices. And lastly, I kind of have to throw this in there. We are completely self-funded. However, we do have a Patreon. So if you like what you heard and you want to chip in, feel free to sign up. I'll put the link in the show notes. You will probably get a sticker package in the mail, some tchotchkes from me, and there will be a Theory of Constraints ToC-aissance sticker in there. So once again, I want to thank Jack for coming on. On behalf of Jack and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast, signing out.